This report started off kind of random, but became more meaningful as it went along. It started by chance when we came across a book that didn't go down the return chute at the library. Glancing at it, we immediately connected Alan Turing, the famous mathematician and computer scientist, with our years-long study in cybernetics. The topic of the book, connectionism and neural networks, was part of a serious inquiry to map and control the functions of the brain, and reciprocally to construct artificial neural networks and brain-like intelligent computers. So it seemed fascinating enough that we flipped through the intro and a few of the other pages before we sit him back down the return chute. It is abundantly clear that Alan Turing is a man who made his mark on society, even though his name was virtually unknown until recent decades when personal computers and the internet brought everything back up again. It's clear that Turing is one of the handful of men who opened the doors to the information age and to the increase of both knowledge and control in all our lives. If the apple symbolizes our knowledge of good and evil, then Alan M. Turing lived and died by the apple. It was reportedly his favorite snack, one he had each night before bed. His favorite movie, Snow White, featured a pivotal poisoned apple scene, and it was later blamed for his death, attributed to suicide by cyanide-laced apple. Though it's important to point out that his death was never properly investigated, and some parties have definitely disputed the idea that he did himself in, suggesting instead an accidental poisoning via his experimental lab where he played with cyanide, or that his murder was made to look like a suicide. After all, among those who knew too much, Turing certainly ranked significantly. It is certainly also plausible that he may have become extremely depressed after the government prosecuted him for his homosexuality, charged him with gross indecency, and made the price for his freedom and his continued research that he submit to chemical castration. Indeed, his treatment was horrible. At any rate, his particular genius in computer architecture played a pivotal role in the development of the digital computer and the decryption of the Enigma code that turned the entire tide of World War II in the Allies' favor. Turing greatly expanded the knowledge of mankind, who was now dabbling in dangerous proportions. Extreme secrecy shrouding his work, as well as criticism by his superiors and his reluctance to publish, likewise held back knowledge from the world, as he played a pivotal role in bringing man one step closer to unleashing artificial intelligence upon the world. This for a man who lived only 41. From his papers derived the early blueprints for AI, his vision for a universal Turing machine, a machine that could be programmed to complete any task, and a machine that could learn and evolve. It was his name that was attached to the Turing test, a hypothetical test on the distinction between man and machine. Could a computer become intelligent enough to convince a human judge that it's human? If so, what will that mean for our species and for the future? The knowledge of what it means to be human and of what constitutes intelligence could change everything. It could even undo us altogether, or shake up our place in the order of things.
I think, in one way, technology has freed us because of the access to information. I also think in another way, it's made us its dependent, because in a lot of ways we can't exist anymore without it. I mean, there's no going back in a way.
I think it expands our horizons, but I guess you can definitely say that it cuts us off from the people around us.
They've made this era the information era. They've really given us access to the whole world. It's not just a question now of going to some library and looking up some obscure book to get knowledge.
The media, what we wear, what we think, it's really influenced just by the internet.
With technology, we are open to more things, but it has confined us to a lot of limited things as well in another perspective, because that's all we do now, as if we were to come together at a social event, all we do is take pictures, go on the internet, go on our phones,
The questions go back much further than the dot-com bubble and the rise of modern high-speed internet. They go back further than the development of ARPANET and local area networks. In the Minds of Men, we explored in depth the connections between the brain and computers, and the computer modeling of the brain with artificial neurons, all central to the science of cybernetics being pursued in the 1940s and 50s, and especially surrounding the influential group in the Macy's Foundation Conference on Cybernetics, also known as circular causal and feedback mechanisms in biological and social systems. They meant to affect the lives of men and society. Behind it was an attempt not only to understand the brain and to increase the complexity of the digital computer, but to usher in an artificial intelligence that could learn and develop from experience and keep up with man's mind. Likewise, it held some very important parallels for how the powers that be might learn society a lesson or two through social programming. The psychology of learning plays into this, dealing in part with feedback and reinforcement, such as with pleasure or reward and pain or punishment. And these questions are very much rooted in the early work and relatively brief career of Alan Turing, though he published infrequently and appeared to keep mostly to himself both personally and professionally. Moreover, many of his achievements were classified, and much of his central work on computer technology and cryptoanalysis was kept secret during and after World War II. However, we do know that Turing was a key member of the Ratio Club, which formed in 1949 as a quasi-secretive dinner club that served as the UK counterpart to the ongoing Macy's Cybernetics meetings taking place in the US. This was the birth of personal computers, robotics, satellites, and artificial intelligence.
It's Tobit, a mechanical tortoise with an electronic brain which functions like the human mind.
Dr. Walter says that his electronic toys work exactly as though they have a simple two-cell nervous system, and that with more cells they will be able to do many more tricks.
A counterpart to Macy's, the Ratio Club was formed in 1949 in the UK. McCullough gave the keynote at the first meeting. Alan Turing, W. Ross Ashby, Gray Walter, and Donald McKay were among its most important members.
We can have automata that are aware of the world about it, able to connect and distinguish between optimal and actual performance.
Again, we came across this book by chance while dropping off some other library books. It was stuck in the chute, so we took a look at it and were immediately interested by Turing's name and his connection to neural networks. Melissa and I snapped some photos of the introduction and forward pages and then turned it back in. Then later we looked it up and found out that this relatively small 200-page book was only available for an astounding $120 and even more. Though I haven't had the chance to read this book from cover to cover, the introductory information is interesting enough and leaves plenty of questions to pursue. It properly paints Turing not just as a man central to computer development, but as an investigator into the human brain, a role that has been little recognized and never publicized in his career and biography. Along with several key colleagues in related fields, Turing was on the cutting edge of tapping into the growing knowledge about the brain in order to construct better computers. And likewise, he was using the connections studied in the digital computer to better describe the complex actions taking place in neural networks inside the brain, and hence, how to understand and manage decisions taking place in the brain. Models created in the digital computer of the brain were also inversely symbolic of the mechanization of the mind, which might one day be conquered one neuron at a time. Turing's Connectionism, an investigation of neural network architectures by Christoph Teucher, highlights a very important case with Turing's 1948 paper, Intelligent Machinery, which was overlooked and buried by his superiors at Britain's National Physical Laboratory, and yet proved to be groundbreaking in the as yet unnamed field of artificial intelligence. It described networks of artificial digital computer-based neurons that were arranged in random connection patterns. The goal then was to train the network to increase the efficiency or even intelligence of the network to the advantage of completing a certain goal. The paper is ultimately so significant and its dismissal by his bosses so conspicuous though we must at least raise the question of whether or not the pursuit of Turing's objectives was merely classified and kept secret rather than tossed out. The National Physical Laboratory, the NPL, was initially going to build the Pilot Ace computer system designed by Turing, but backed out after they thought it was too complex and didn't understand how to put it together, and was also expensive. And yet afterwards, the director of the NPL, Charles Galton Darwin, who just so happened to be the grandson of the famous scientist Charles Darwin, dismissed Turing's paper on artificial intelligence on a nascent technology that he foresaw in great detail as that of a schoolboy's essay. He acted like it was simple and insignificant and kind of silly. It doesn't make sense, it doesn't really add up, but that's what's reported. And it was this treatment that prompted Turing to take a 12-month sabbatical from the NPL to pursue research on the biological side of higher brain functions in developing his intelligent machinery. The chief question of this pursuit was, could a machine be made that could learn from experience? And it was this research that Charles Galton Darwin, who supposedly forecast the next 1,000,000 years of man's evolution, it was this research that he short-sightedly dismissed as, quote, a bit thin for a year's time off. A system to make a thinking machine that could learn from experience. That was a bit thin. That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous to think that a serious laboratory would dismiss this kind of research as silly and insignificant and boyish. So what was the true end for Turing's vision of a learning and self-organized intelligent computer system? What was it really headed towards, especially since we know that it's completely still relevant today and happening and getting more and more sophisticated on a daily and weekly basis? Authors Copeland and Proudfoot write, Turing was probably the first person to consider building computing machines out of simple neuron-like elements connected together in networks in a largely random manner. Alan Turing's attempt to build a, quote, brain for the NPL and later for Manchester University was not just bluster and metaphor about a powerful computing system, but it was a literal attempt to create a thinking or intelligent machine that operated like a brain. Turing was after the power of, quote, connectionism to modify and improve brain performance. With larger and larger amounts of data, he theorized that the computer could either search, unassisted, for better solutions which it could trial and error, and then modify neural net connections in its artificial brain, or that it could be taught with supervised learning from a teacher, and that such a machine could learn which connections were most useful or rewarding, even if it didn't understand what was happening, and then strengthen them while weakening or terminating useless or unimportant connections.
This machine has stored program, and that is the thing which makes the computer revolution possible.
Turing's connectionism then anticipated and paralleled the work of Professor Donald Hebb, who we also talked about in The Minds of Men, of McGill University, who was studying the changing connections of the brain. In conjunction with his famous 1949 work, The Organization of Behavior, Hebb famously quipped, quote, neurons that fire together wire together. And this is sort of the maxim for connectionism in the brain. Neurons that fire together, wire together. In other words, it works very similar to how water takes the path of least resistance. So when you watch raindrops run down a window, it follows a repeated network of paths. It doesn't create new paths every time. It kind of goes with the flow. And so too do neurons create worthwhile pathways and strongly associate themselves with the neurons that were part of that rewarding pathway. Mired in frustration over the significant delays in building his ACE computer and the short-sightedness in the objectives and the priorities of the NPL, Turing broke, quote, a gentleman's agreement with Charles Galton Darwin and instead left to take a position as deputy director of the Royal Society Computer Machine Laboratory at Manchester University, which is connected and sponsored by the Royal Society of Science. And he went there after his hiatus, and this was the place where the first stored program electronic digital computer was officially born in 1948. They had it first. And even though he didn't design this computer and he didn't get to build his computer until a little later on, Alan Turing was there with the open arms of a father, ready to use this machine and put it to work as soon as he could get his hands on it, and to put it to use for his line of inquiry into the brain and to the genetic structure that underlies intelligent life. And so Turing was, from virtually the very beginning of the digital computer, pursuing a life. That's artificial life, artificial intelligence. And it wasn't just computer engineering and theory for the sake of programming better computers. His work and the work of several other important figures, such as von Neumann, it was always about the biological link to the brain and the processes of the body. And strangely enough, the computer was never just about the computer and calculations and how to make that work better and faster. It was actually always about this parallel to the brain and providing a sort of vessel to try to dig in and understand the ultimate black box, the complicated biological machinery that society throughout history had struggled to understand. And now they were making breakthroughs in large part because of the development of the modern digital computer. So Turing wrote to fellow cybernetician and Ratio Club member W. Ross Ashby circa 1947 and told him his design for the ACE automated computer engine was ultimately geared towards studying the brain. He said, quote, "In working on the ACE, I am more interested in the possibility of producing models of the action of the brain than in the practical applications to computing." So he said it straightforwardly. In point of fact, Ashby had been hoping to use Turing's ACE-1 computer at the NPL to build his homeostat model of the brain, which Turing encouraged and endorsed as his primary focus in this 1946 letter. However, the NPL under Darwin proved its, quote, inability or unwillingness to properly manage the construction of the machine. And in 1951, Turing wrote to his former assistant, who was at the NPL, quote, "Our new machine, the Ferrante Mark I, is to start arriving on Monday, and I'm hoping, as one of the first jobs, to do something about chemical embryology. In particular, I think one could account for the appearance of Fibonacci numbers in connection with fir cones." As Christopher Teucher writes, Turing used the Ferrante Mark I to simulate a chemical mechanism by which the genes of a zygote may determine the anatomical structure of the resulting animal or plant. And he was the first person to engage in this computer-assisted exploration of, quote, nonlinear dynamic systems. He was the first person to use a computer to explore these genetic and biological aspects. And it's very significant and I think pretty surprising, because when you hear Alan Turing's name, that's not the kind of work that comes to mind. In fact, I think very few people know about that. But to go back to cybernetics and its connection with Turing and the origins of all this, we see that Turing was long connected to the unfolding cybernetics movement. His early theoretical work in computers was essential to this movement, and the time that he spent in the US at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Studies put him in contact not only with Albert Einstein, but more to the point, with John von Neumann, and they formed a relationship that lasted, even though Turing turned down a job to work with von Neumann and went back to Britain instead. They still had made an important connection that would play out over a number of years. And von Neumann was the Hungarian emigre who, on the one hand, was responsible for sort of selling the atomic bomb research to the military, and he helped certain technical aspects of the atomic bomb and worked on the Manhattan Project. But on the other hand, he would take credit for the primary architecture of the stored programmed digital computer. Turing and von Neumann together. I mean, truthfully, the digital computer had many fathers, Turing among them, and it was never just von Neumann or just Turing, but they all played a key role and a pivotal part in it. At any rate, von Neumann's core participation in the Macy's cybernetic group from its very first meeting in 1942 brought the burgeoning power of digital computation and all the things associated with it that von Neumann, among others, knew was coming, as well as the work of Alan Turing, to the fore of this very important convergence and explosion of information that would change a great deal, perhaps even quote-unquote everything. 11 years before Turing's 1948 intelligent machinery paper was his 1936-37 paper on computable numbers with an application to the Entscheidungs problem, which in English is the decision problem, which is basically how are decisions made, how do you mathematically determine how decisions are made and what apparatus could do that, etc. It's kind of one of these age-old problems that mathematicians and philosophers have studied for a number of years, and he took that on. At any rate, this 1936-37 paper was almost the only paper that Turing was known for at all, because so much of the rest of his career was kept entirely secret, especially due to the work that he did during during the war that basically little else that Turing had done was known until decades after his untimely death in 1954. This 1937 paper on computable numbers was also the paper that first proposed the universal Turing machine, a key concept here, as an answer to the decision problem that was presented again by earlier mathematicians. By using, quote, an algorithm, such a machine could find the solution to any problem, Turing argued, so long as the solution was A, possible, and B, that the instructions to the query were input in precise and finite terms. Nothing could be ambiguous. If the directions are very clear, then if the thing can have a solution, this machine will be able to do it. Essentially, if it was programmed properly, it could do anything. Turing's key paper set the stage for the success of the digital electronic stored memory computer and established the modus operandi for answering investigative questions not only about the machine but about man and his brain. Chief among these would remain the Turing test question itself, the imitation game that Turing came up with, the ongoing question of whether or not a machine could be intelligent or could think, and whether or not it could fool a human judge into thinking that it was a human. And this was again central to the cybernetics group and the Macy's Foundation. As scientific historian and author Lily Kay wrote, von Neumann's general interest in biological automata were aroused in the early 1940s, primarily through his camaraderie with Norbert Wiener. Captivated by the 1943 paper of Warren McCullough and Walter Pitt's A Logical Calculus of the Ideas, Immanent, and Nervous Activity, which he read on Wiener and Bigelow's urgings, von Neumann immediately saw its potential for treating biological phenomena as information systems. He helped popularize the paper even before the Macy's conferences lavished attention on McCullough. McCullough, a psychiatrist and philosopher by training, then working at the University of Illinois, and Pitts, who was trained under Reshevsky and Carnap in mathematical logic, and then employed at MIT's Research Laboratory of Electronics, joined together with a unique combination of skills and temperaments to construct a mathematical model of the neural networks of the brain based on Carnap's logical calculus and on Alan Turing's work on theoretical machines. So it all centered around this. Neurons were treated as black boxes, obeying mathematical rules governing the input and output of signals. A unit psychic event, or quote psychon, was based on all or none, 1 or 0, yes or no impulses of neurons combined by convergence upon the next neuron to yield complexes of propositional events. These logic-driven representations of biological mechanisms served as epistemic modules in the design of military cybernetic systems of the 1940s and 50s, a point McCullough appreciated quite early. By the early 1960s, the military establishment would come to honor McCullough as the high priest of cybernetics, bionics, or self-organizing systems, whatever you call it. Since his captivation by the promise and applicability of McCullough's work to design the biological automata and concurrent immersion in computing, von Neumann began cultivating contacts with the biomedical community. He also started to participate in various interdisciplinary conferences, including the Macy's conferences that linked areas of life science to physics, mathematics, and cybernetics. His interest in biology in general and genetics in particular became closely linked to his mission of developing self-reproducing machines. That project aimed at simultaneously explaining and simulating living systems, and thus opening up a space of representation in which heredity was to be modeled on simulacra. The Macy Group's key features bridge the space between mechanical and artificial, and the behavior and cycles of living biological entities. And Alan Turing, somewhat surprisingly, bridged that gap in his personal work as well, finding biological answers with the computer and modeling the computer after biological functionality of the brain. And the results, all these years later, have largely held up to scrutiny. Untrained in biology as he was, Turing's theories nonetheless created some worthwhile breakthroughs. By 1950, Turing began using the powerful new digital computer to explore embryology and morphogenesis, as well as the natural pattern unfolding that is evident in plants and animals alike. How exactly does a full-grown animal or baby derive from tiny cells and even tinier patterns of information? In 1952, Turing published The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis, proposing a reaction diffusion system of chemical synthesis, wherein so-called morphogens, chemical structures, one of which was activating, one of which was inhibiting, react and spread throughout tissue with a varied effect on growth patterns that's reflected in stripes and spots and patterns of development of all sorts that we recognize throughout the animal and plant kingdom. In 1953, Turing suggested that this chemical morphogenesis, which ultimately creates a resonant frequency waveform that alters the creation, quote, might be the main means by which the chemical information contained in the genes was converted into a geometrical form. And I think this really gets into the heart of the matter. I think at its root, cyberneticians weren't just interested in advancing the various branches of science or sort of bringing them together in a general way. I think they really wanted to dig into what was the meat of the issue, what were the bits and pieces that constructed this thing we call life and the existence that we know, what really was mechanically, what was the interface of how this all happened.
The neural nets project of McCullough and Pitts spearheaded this cognitivist turn in the 1940s. Science of mind thus became a science of signals based on binary logic. Neural nets bridge the gulf between body and mind, matter and form. Matter and form.
The discussion began at von Neumann's request, a conversation about consciousness as to whether there is an anatomical substrate for what has everybody knowing things.
They had a universal mechanism to create goal-seeking behavior that made machines and even people basically programmable on the influence of a feedback system.
When we were talking this morning, von Neumann was saying that the brain could not be an analog calculating machine, but must be a digital one.
A machine with an analogic part and a digital part.
So the analog part is able to create analogies that mirror observed actions in human beings with whom we communicate.
Tapestry woven from the memories of past sensations.
And I think at least some of them were not going to be satisfied with anything short of an understanding of what that was. And in doing so, Turing, among others, explored the development of the individual organism from out of the code that could be replicated and reproduced over and over again with very little loss or changes other than mutations. And it's very significant that his theory of chemical synthesis of these activating and inhibiting agents were responsible for the particulars of creation, all the way down to the idea of how information contained in genes was converted into a physical form, a geometrical structure. Indeed, it's key to the whole game and the larger objectives of cybernetics that Alan Turing came very close to the point at which information in the form of genetic code manifests in the real or material world. Though embryology and morphology have become routine parts of biology, it is taken for granted that this is where the rubber meets the road and where the magic happens, where ideas and code takes root in the physical form. Philosophically, this is a very big thing. Alan Turing was invited to these Macy's meetings, but declined the invitation. However, many of his colleagues in the Ratio Club did cross over the pond to visit the U.S. The link between the Ratio Club and the Macy's Cybernetics meetings was therefore quite strong. Notably, Norbert Wiener had visited in 1947, 2 years prior to the group's formation, where he not only met with J.B.S. Haldane, a biologist who would integrate his field with information theory, but also with, quote, those doing work on ultra-rapid computer machines, that is, most notably Alan Turing, with whom Wiener discussed the, quote, fundamental ideas of cybernetics. Cybernetics founder Norbert Wiener echoed Turing's imitation game, arguing that modern technology has given man the ability to create life, even if it's artificial and machine-like. Wiener stated,
the existing natural reflexes are essentially part of the same mechanism that can inform all purposeful activity in automata. One need merely supply a circuit with receptors and effectors. Then they become goal-seeking devices.
and that, as one of Wiener's feedback-driven automata, machines would not only be able to learn from experience, but that such machines had the capability to transmit a message with precise instructions on how to replicate itself, thus transmitting and copying the image of artificial life, and therefore giving it the ability to construct offspring machines. In God and Golem Inc., Wiener thus outlines the powerful dangers of the technology he helped create, as man and machine were in the early 60s poised to gain godlike powers over life and death. Indeed, cyberneticians could now create the golem of legend out of metal and silicon.
Man makes man in his own image. This seems to be the echo or the prototype of the act of creation by which God is supposed to have made man in his image. Can something similar occur in the less complicated and therefore more understandable case of non-living systems that we call machines? What is the image of a machine? Can this image, as embodied in one machine, bring a machine of a general sort not yet committed to a particular specific identity to reproduce the original machine, either absolutely or under some change that may be construed as a variation? Can the new and varied machine itself act as an archetype, even as to its own departures from its own archetypal pattern? It is to the purpose of the present section to answer these questions, and to answer them by yes. Different as mechanical and biological reproduction may be, they are parallel processes, achieving similar results. In order to discuss intelligently the problem of a machine constructing another after its own image, we must make the notion of image more precise. Here we must be aware that there are images and images. Pygmalion made the statue of Galatea in the image of his ideal beloved, but after the gods brought it to life, it became an image of his beloved in a much more real sense. It was no longer merely a pictorial image, but an operative image. The operative images which perform the functions of their original may or may not bear a pictorial likeness to it. Whether they do or not, they may replace the original in its action, and this is a much deeper similarity. It is from the standpoint of operative similarity that we shall study the possible reproduction of machines. But what is a machine? For us, a machine is a device for converting incoming messages into outgoing messages. The machine as an instrument and as message thus suggests the sort of duality which is so dear to the physicist. It is exemplified by duality between wave and particle. Thus the machine may generate the message, and the message may generate another machine. It is like the witticism that a hen is merely an egg's way of making another egg. This is an idea with which I have toyed before, that it is conceptually possible for a human being to be sent over a telegraph line. The idea is impracticable, but it is not on that account inconceivable. However, it is a thoroughly realizable concept in the case of man-made machines, from the message carrying the operational image of the machine. In describing the particular embodiment that I shall choose for the operational pattern of the machine to be reproduced, I also describe the formal character of the pattern, and it must be in mathematical terms. This is in fact very similar to what occurs in the fundamental act of reproduction of living matter. Here too, a substrate capable of assuming a large number of forms, molecular structures in this case, is caused to assume a particular form by the presence of a structure, a molecule, that already possesses this form. The multiplication of living matter occurs by a well-described template process in which the nucleic acids determine the laying down of amino acids, and this chain is double, consisting of a pair of complementary spirals. When these separate, each gathers to itself the molecular residues needed to reconstruct the double spiral of the original chain, and thus a reliable copy is made.
In Life's Code Script by Sidney Brenner, the Nature Journal highlighted the significance and the irony in that Turing's specific and technical definition of a universal Turing machine, which could theoretically accomplish any task if the program gives directions that are sufficiently clear as to what is to be accomplished, it best fits not merely a computer or a machine or a more advanced algorithm so much as it almost mirrors the reproduction of biological life according to minutely encoded and incredibly complex directions. Quote, Turing introduced what became known as the Turing machine to formalize the computation. Essentially, the system is a set of instructions written on the tape which describes the machine. Turing also defined a universal Turing machine which could carry out any computation for which an instruction can be written. This is the origin of the digital computer. Nowhere else are there such complicated systems in which every organism contains an internal description of itself. The concept of the gene as a symbolic representation of the organism, a code script, is a fundamental feature of the living world and must form the kernel of biological theory. And yet, at the same time, it matches up almost perfectly with Turing's definition of the universal Turing machine and the instructions for giving instructions to a computer. And Nature observes, quote, Turing invented the stored program computer, and von Neumann showed that the description is separate from the universal constructor. This is not trivial. Physicist Erwin Schrödinger confused the program and the constructor in his 1944 book, What is Life?, in which he saw chromosomes as, quote, architect's plan and builder's craft in one. But this is wrong. The code script contains only a description of the executive function, not the function itself. How that function is enacted and how it brings a code script to bring about life is still something of a mystery and taps into the meaning of God and everything else. In fact, it may be the deepest mystery of them all, perhaps the most closely guarded secret of all antiquity, known only to the innermost priesthood.
Cybernetic at heart, these inherited secrets fueled the minds of the ancient philosophers and mathematicians.
Thereafter, priest classes, secret societies, and elite organizations of learned men.
After summing up this history of scientific progress, he paused. The room went silent. And he said, if you want to get behind the fake explanation of how our world comes to be as it is, then you must find the facts for yourself and accept nothing in addition but logic and mathematics.
And while these computer scientists were not ignorant of revelations in biology and regularly took in topical information from experts in biology and other fields, von Neumann and Turing's prescient connections between computers, biological life, and mental connectivity were all carried out well before Crick and Watson announced their discovery of DNA to the world in 1953, and at a time when the gene was theorized and known but elusive and not pinned down and still theoretical and very far from being fully understood. Significantly, the information theory established by Claude Shannon and Norbert Wiener, again core cyberneticians, holds that information is a different state from matter and energy. It's not used up, dissipated, or destroyed, but its image can project onto the chemical processes of any and all matter. The inherent codes, such as those of the reoccurring Fibonacci sequence, can and do manifest throughout creation without loss. The information is the image, the code, the message, the word, genetic structures loaded with encrypted information, imaged onto reproductions, creations out of a pattern. This then comes back around to the purpose and direction of Turing's attempt to train the higher functions of the brain on his computers. Again, he was frustrated at the dull efforts of his colleagues at the MPL and their bureaucratic slow work in attempting to pursue only the lower functions of the nervous system and kind of have a rudimentary, base robotic kind of response. Turing was more interested in his theories on, quote, the supervised learning in the form of evolutionary algorithms. He wanted to be able to train initially random artificial neural nets for specific functions. And through reinforcement, including pain and pleasure, these effective or efficient neural pathways could be strengthened and fast-tracked enough that a, quote, growth process and metabolic change could take place. To me, it's very much like beating a path through the woods. The first time someone walks through it, you would hardly notice the difference, but after hundreds of people, hundreds of animals walk through it day after day over time, it becomes a clearly beaten path that gradually grows wider and carries more and more traffic on it. So then likewise, Turing theorized less successful synaptic pathways, those that were wrong or not rewarding or more or less useless, they would weaken and deteriorate, and the brain would sort of rewire itself as things went on, which is what they found biologically. The result, however, would not necessarily guarantee optimal biological utility.
The human brain is the center of the network of fibers that make up man's nervous system. A pulpy mass of cells and fibers, the brain.
Turing wrote to biologist J.Z. Young, another Macy's Cybernetic Conference attendee from Britain, that, quote, "I'm afraid I'm very far from the stage where I feel inclined to start talking about any anatomical questions about the brain. According to my notions of how to set about it, that will not occur until a late stage when I have a fairly definite theory about how things are done. At present, I'm not working on the problem at all, but on my mathematical theory of embryology. This is yielding to treatment, and it will, so far as I could see, give satisfactory explanations of 1. Gastrulation, 2. Polygonal symmetrical structures, e.g. starfish, flowers, 3. Leaf arrangement, in particular the way the Fibonacci series comes to be involved, 4. Color patterns of animals, e.g. stripes, spots, and dappling, 5. Patterns on nearly spherical structures such as some radiolaria, but this is much more difficult and doubtful. I'm really doing this now because it's yielding more easily to treatment. I think it's not altogether unconnected with the other problem. The brain structure has to be one which can be achieved by the genetical embryological mechanism. And I hope that this theory that I'm now working on may make clearer what restrictions this really implies. What you tell me about the growth of neurons under stimulation is very interesting in this connection. It suggests means by which the neurons might be made to grow so as to form a particular circuit, then to reach a particular place. So again, he wanted to know more about the brain through the computer. He was frustrated at these rudimentary attempts to come at the nervous system as a basic sort of response situation. He wanted to deal with the higher structures of the brain, of the essential questions of thinking and learning and intelligence, and instead found himself going back to the very beginning and coming about it through a sort of roundabout, minute way through the embryology of the brain. He wanted to find out what it was about the brain structure that had to be achieved and accomplished and coded and unfolded at the embryological level through the genetic mechanism for embryology, through the code that was being built and constructed through the very complex process of biological systems. That was one of the main pathways of how he hoped to learn about brain structure and how to make better brains. It's very fascinating and I think pretty deep. I mean, after all, the unfolding of the codes for growth and development of the brain during embryology would indeed be valuable tools in the hands of a genetic engineer. Just as the Fibonacci spiral unfolds into 3D space to create forms, the brain structure must be unfolded from a particular pattern, and Turing was genius in his instinct to zero in on it. In fact, his thoughts on morphology were way ahead of their time and yet have been validated since as being on the right track. And as authors Proudfoot and Copeland explained, Turing's deeper motivation for modeling the brain was to create structures useful to learning that could advance or evolve machines, but probably also organisms, or alternatively, the organization of superbiological organisms such as human society itself. Hence, in time, an advanced neural network, artificial or artificially stimulated, would carry out repeated genetic or evolutionary search, in Turing's terms, to find the gene combination with the highest survival value. Turing theorized that, quote, intellectual activity consists mainly of various kinds of search, inputs for a trial and error, basically, and therefore effective search and evaluation through rewarding neural net pathways was itself a pathway to machine intelligence. And when carried out on a machine level, this would, in theory, be more than just a metaphor, but a realistic form of genetic adaptation at the mechanical and non-biological level. And when carried out biologically, there's no theoretical limit to the rapid evolution that a computer could assist in biological determinism, whether it was ultimately for good or for ill. And I'd be very skeptical, of course, but it'd be a very powerful tool and a very dangerous one. The possibilities are simply staggering and likely very frightening. Society directed by human cabals are already very cold and calculating and often inhumane in their utilitarian determinations of what is best for people who have little choice but to go along with the tide of centralized government and mega-industrialized society. And in the hands of a highly advanced computer, we could expect many efficient and effective solutions, but we could hardly rely upon the human determinations of a machine that has proved less than apt to grasp at what it actually means to be human. Morally, philosophically, socially, spiritually, the machine remains quite different and probably wouldn't be very concerned with our central concerns as humans, so it would be very dangerous. And yet that's definitely where things are headed today and in the foreseeable future. Ultimately, we are surprised perhaps at finding the famous computer scientist Alan Turing not only studying and modeling the brain, but searching for knowledge of how the brain develops from embryo, and hence where its control switches are. If this is possible, then producing the type of brain one wants might be possible. Creating a sequence of castes, a system designed by the controllers to put people in different categories, perhaps. The embryonic stage is where the right developments and growth spurts and the key moments that determine the organism to be and its abilities and metabolisms take place. So there's a lot of information related to this in the book written by the late Lily Kay, who wrote the Book of Life, A History of the Genetic Code, which connected cybernetics and information science not only with genetics, but ultimately with the alteration of reality, with this larger attempt to change things on the whole. And in her book, she quotes from molecular biologist Robert Sensheimer, who was the progenitor of the Human Genome Project and who was the author of the 1967 The Book of Life. He said, "The Book of Life, in this book are instructions and a curious and wonderful code for making a human being. In one sense, on a subconscious level, every human being is born knowing how to read this book in every cell of his body. But on the level of conscious knowledge, it's a major triumph of biology in the past 2 decades that we've begun to understand the content of these books in the language in which they are written. This is the code of life, the book of life, being translated and decoded for the people who are in power and who have been in power throughout all this time." Lily Kay's other book, which is a very damning investigative history piece, The Molecular Vision of Life, Caltech, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Rise of New Biology, makes a very strong connection between the sponsorship and the foundation grants that went to key universities and the agenda of eugenics, an outright agenda on the part of the Rockefeller Foundation to create a science of life, a control over all the functions of the cycle of biological life. They wanted the codes and the keys and the buttons to what makes people tick, and of course animal and plant life as well. They wanted a complete, thorough understanding of genetics, not in of itself for the scientific knowledge, although that's also clearly important, but they wanted it for its utilization in social engineering, social control, which they already had a great deal of, but clearly wanted more of. And you've got to read that book for yourself, both of these books. They make a very strong case as to what was really going on and what agendas were taking place here. At any rate, let's turn to Warren McCulloch and Turing, core members of the cyber paradigm that we now inhabit. And we talk a lot about Warren McCulloch in depth in The Minds of Men. He has a lot of screen time in the cybernetics section, and I think for good reason, because of the philosophical aspects of his cybernetic investigation. You know, he was trained in neurology and psychiatry and related fields. He was working with symptomology of disease and with people's brains, and he was tinkering with this stuff. But he wasn't just tinkering for an understanding of the brain or to treat disease or to deal with hospital patients. Warren McCulloch was one of these people who were digging into things to find the philosophical root of what makes this all work, what was really going on. That's what he was after. It was a quest for knowledge, much like Turing, and not just for practical reasons. At any rate, Warren McCulloch was either working closely with Turing or he was continually modeling his work off of Turing's work. Warren McCulloch had been invited to London in 1949 to preside over the first Ratio Club meeting, where he gave the presentation, Finality and Form in Nervous Activity. It was likely during this visit that McCulloch met Alan Turing, who was invited to join the Ratio Club after the first meeting to check the biologist with a mathematician or two. Indeed, the ground between biology and mathematics met in the cybernetic applications of the computer, which Turing was now pursuing at Manchester University. While Turing had earlier given an influential talk on educating a digital computer to the club in 1950, by 1952, Alan Turing was lecturing to the Ratio Club on the chemical origin of biological form. After multiple visits to England to attend Ratio Club meetings, McCullough invited Alan Turing to the final Macy's Cybernetic Conference in 1953, not long before he ended up dying in 1954, acknowledging Turing's deep contribution to its origins. But curiously, Alan Turing declined the invitation to attend the Macy's conference. He sent a polite letter, he made excuses that he was a stay-at-home type, he suggested he was unwilling to make a transatlantic voyage, he mentioned that a new school term was starting, but ultimately he suggested that he was unlikely to get permission to go. And as Klaus Pius pointed out in his introduction to the Cybernetics book, clearly secrecy and confidentiality remain a sort of elephant in the room.
What subsequently took place behind the closed doors of the glorious Beekman Hotel on New York's Park Avenue is only hinted at by the peculiar textual records associated with the conference. We fight in our shirt sleeves, and we do not even publish the proceedings until every man has had the chance to go over what he has said and delete the more objectionable phrases. In order not to air dirty laundry from the events, the participants' presentations and discussions were heavily redacted for the press.
And it was this that was likely constraining both Turing and many of these other scientists who were part of this group. Von Neumann, for one, died under armed guard, under military watch to make sure that state secrets didn't leak out when he was in a delirious state, etc. Secrecy was a big part of this, and it seemed like a shroud over Turing's life. But moreover, such a secrecy probably still holds a shroud over our knowledge and our understanding of what was attempted and what was pursued and what was actually accomplished. Basically, all the stuff they were looking into is still quasi-forbidden fruit. It's still kept by those in power, and our understanding of what they were even looking into is kind of infantile because so much of it is still secret. The club faded out by 1955, shortly after Turing's tragic death and after the president of the Royal Society had endorsed the concepts of cybernetics within the framework of, quote, every conceivable branch of biology. Either way, Warren McCullough's career and his key interests paralleled and continued to follow those of Alan Turing. Despite the lack of a clear record of their collaboration, they have all these clear overlaps in their work. But despite their shared interest and many close contacts, Alan Turing didn't seem to like Warren McCullough very much. And throughout his career, he failed to reference the very important work that McCullough and Pitts had done, and in particular their seminal paper, their 1943 paper on neuronal calculus that was based on Turing's work and that had most meaningfully responded and advanced those concepts. Conference chairman Warren McCullough had taken things a step further, showing how the operation of the human brain can be represented by on and off electric switching devices.
It is stop or go, on or off, one or none.
His 1943 paper with Walter Pitts on the logical calculus of neuronal activity introduced the concept of the neural net and showed how the communication of neurons could be modeled by a digital computer. It was McCullough and Pitt's paper that was pivotal to the cybernetics meeting and the convergence of knowledge around that had taken Turing's universal machine concept and used it to open up pivotal questions that were central to Turing's own interest. McCullough and Pitts were modeling neural nets in the brain on the basis of Turing's math about universal machines using mathematical logic to try to work out how brain structures work using these artificial neuron models. It was completely up Turing's alley and directly paralleled Turing's work. First of all, McCullough gave Turing a lot of credit for starting off his work, and he made this clear in remarks from discussion in a von Neumann lecture from 1948. McCullough said, quote, "I started entirely in the wrong angle, and it was not until I saw Turing's paper from 36-37 that I began to get going the right way around, and with Pitt's help, formulated the required logical calculus. What we thought we were doing, and I think we succeeded fairly well, was treating the brain as a Turing machine. So the entire cybernetics movement, in a way, was based around looking into the brain, but treating the brain as a Turing machine and following the same rules that would work mechanically for a computer as you would with a biological person or organism. And it wasn't just the modeling of the brain with artificial neural nets, but it was the deeper sort of philosophical stuff that it connected to. In his writings, McCullough waxed philosophical about the form and finality of ideas that Plato had first waxed intellectual about, and their relation to the logos, a very important but understated cybernetic pursuit. And logos has several profound meanings, dictionary definitions that sort of overlap and play upon each other. The first definition, logos, is the word of God, the revelatory word mentioned in the Bible. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. In a different definition, the logos is the word or form which expresses a thought. It's the structure or physical form that comes out of the idea. That's the logos. The logos is also described as the rational principle in the universe. This is the logical calculus that these trained mathematicians were pursuing along very rigorous lines in order to prove something underlying, something completely elusive about the brain and about our spirit, about who we are. And to his own satisfaction, McCullough found answers about the logos in cybernetics. And this is also something that Lily Kay wrote about in some of her papers. At any rate, in a television interview, Warren McCullough cryptically mused that it took him 40 years to learn to count a pine cone, for heaven's sake.
I'm hung up on theoretical problems. I'd love to know the theory of knots. It took me 40 years to learn to count a pine cone, for heaven's sake. But I never let go of those things, they just keep churning.
And again, it parallels the fact that Turing took a very deep interest in the Fibonacci number pattern and the growth of living things, and he would basically stare at daisies and watch them grow and ponder what created the sort of spiral pattern, especially in plants, but also in animals, seashells, etc. And he did his first mathematical studies with the computer on the fir cone as a prime example of his inquiry into Fibonacci. And so McCullough and Turing were both looking at the pine cone, the fir cone, and its unraveling pattern as key to decoding the mystery of embryology, of morphology, of how the brain develops, how it works, and what the key inputs are to even create the thing that it is. And eventually this reached into Turing's theories on morphology, where ultimately it was a resonant frequency, a particular wavelength that achieved this by competing chemical activators and inhibitors that created the geometric forms out of the genetic code. These were ideas encoded and imprinted and then brought to life, as it were, by the breath of God in several definitions, biblically, spiritually, scientifically, rationally. This was the logos, the point at which the code turns into physical manifestations, at which the code of life turns into life. And again, McCullough and Turing were digging as deeply into this as any scientist that I know of. It's the kind of stuff that the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, what have you, were looking into, but never really were able to tackle, that we know of anyway. Either way, the models of Alan Turing were no longer just those of Alan Turing. They were being put to work. They were formulated as the basic framework around which the entire Macy's cybernetic group, which was multidisciplinary and took place in all these different fields, is a basic framework that they all must respect in pursuing these larger questions, all based around Alan Turing and his universal Turing machine. It followed that once Turing proposed the rules for the universal Turing machine, i.e. that it could carry out any order provided the instructions were precise and finitely stated, then McCullough and Pitts could employ the rules of logic, which is critical to computer theory, in order to simulate and theorize the neural nets of the brain. And the brain then could be treated like a universal Turing machine and then explored and experimented upon in ways that other scientists before them could only dream of, could only imagine. They were able to tap into it this way and extract information from the elusive black box that for centuries, for millennia, has yielded so little information about its inner workings. And therefore, in the larger picture of cybernetics, automata, or goal-seeking mechanisms, brought in a sense of purpose, and through the use of feedback to guide and direct these automata mechanisms, the input and the output that gave the basis for a decision, you had a closed loop of an organism a man, animal, and machine that was connected with its environment. And through changing the environment, you could change even the very mental life of the man, animal, machine. You could change the conclusions and understandings that it holds internally because it's fed by sensory information. I don't know. It's pretty complicated. If you haven't seen The Minds of Men, please watch it just so you can understand this better. Cybernetics pioneer Norbert Wiener, whose work is featured prominently in The Minds of Men, wrote, "The newer study of automata, whether in the metal or in the flesh, is a branch of communication engineering, and its cardinal notions are those of the message, the amount of disturbance or noise, the quantity of information, the coding technique, and so on." As scientific historian and author Lily Kay wrote, according to Wiener, this cybernetic phenomenology of the body obtained also on the cellular and subcellular levels of life. Partly through his ongoing dialogue with geneticist and evolutionary biologist J.B.S. Haldane, Wiener prophesied a cybernetics of heredity. As in all transmissions of messages, such a protein-based genetic transmission could be ultimately explained by information theory. Wiener believed that one could, in principle, transmit the coded messages that compose a human being, that it should be possible to write and therefore control the book of life. As David Noble has written, taken together, these cybernetic preoccupations gave rise to an unwieldy new meta-theory of systems in quest for total control. This was ultimately about the total control of life. Could it even be the end of humanity? The result was history. An alchemical reaction to the coordination and synthesis of the Macy's conferences and the larger work they were part of, not only unleashing Alan Turing's artificial intelligence, but reformulating society, re-establishing the paradigms for understanding humanity under a global mechanistic framework, and making inevitable a Hegelian synthesis from the thesis of man and the antithesis of his imitator, the growing and advancing intelligent machine, into a new species and a new epoch that is in every way poised to be transhuman, either a merge or a rewrite, anything but a passing fad. It now exists as a legitimate threat. Klaus Pias writes in the introduction to the Transactions of the Macy's Cybernetic Conferences that, in effect, the end of humanity has been brought about by the initial pivotal act of treating the brain as a Turing machine, and hence enabling an artificial brain, an artificial intelligence, and an artificial life. It has now been a long time coming. Indeed, it is not lightly or insignificantly that we have reached this precipice. Pias writes from page 15, this set of models had three main elements, each of which derived from American research conducted in the early 1940s. First, the logical calculus of Pitt's and McCullough's neuron model. Second, Shannon's information theory. And third, the behavioral theory formulated by Wiener, Bigelow, and Rosenbluth. In other words, a universal theory of digital machines, a stochastic theory of the symbolic, and a non-deterministic yet teleological theory of feedback were combined at the Macy's conferences into a single theory that could then claim validity for living organisms as well as machines, for economic as well as psychological processes, for sociological as well as aesthetic phenomena. Man could be placed in a technical loop, and his behavior modified. Walter Pitts and Warren McCullough's 20-page article from 1943, A Logical Calculus Immanent and the Ideas of Nervous Activity, begins with the most ambitious goal imaginable, namely that of writing, in McCullough's words, quote, a theory in terms so general that the creations of God and men almost exemplify it, end quote. With a mixture of notations from Carnap, Russell, and their own invention, the authors sought to devise a sort of logical calculus of immanence. They expressed neuronal interactions as propositional functions that in turn could be expressed as neuronal interactions. And this meant first that to understand a given aspect of the nervous system, it would be sufficient to conceive it as an embodiment of Boolean algebra. The material reality of slimy brain matter is at best a sloppy instantation of pure and elegant switching logic on the Platonic, quote, instruments of time. This concept of embodied mathematics implied, second, that logical notations could be applied for any number of uses, be it to describe synapses or vacuum tubes, switches, or ink on paper. Pitt's and McCullough's ideas were thus able to serve simultaneously as neurophysiological, philosophical, and computer technical concepts that operate and function, that can explicate both theoretical and practical entities, and that could be used to both model neuronal structures as well as to construct artifacts, exactly as John von Neumann, with this essay in hand, set out to construct digital computers. And this meant, third, that if all neuronal functions could be recorded as embodiments of logical calculus, it would probably have to be admitted that everything that could be known in and by means of logical calculus. Epistemology merged with psychology. Kant's synthetic a priori became a circuit and was thus no longer a purely human matter. Or in other words, for every conceivable thought, a network could be devised that connects it to and is thus able to think, whereby the mind or spirit, Geist, suddenly finds itself on the engineer's desk. Quote, mind no longer goes more ghostly than a ghost, as McCullough wrote. With this deconstructive turn, it was thought that the human had become a special sort of information machine, and information machines had become the general concept behind all, quote, communication. The human self appeared to be computationally constituted, in McCullough's words, and this is because the self not only made sense of its experiences through the conscious manipulation of symbols, it had also, moreover, ensured that experiences of any sort could only be made possible by means of the unconscious manipulation of symbols. The new cognitive conception of man in terms of its logical circuits possessed not only the elegance of a micro and macroscopically functioning model of universal manipulation, but for this very reason, it was also perfectly compatible with Claude Shannon's information theory, which is likewise based on the digital, something that could be transmitted without loss regardless of the materiality of its instances, just as McCullough's circuits could be implemented without loss in flesh or metal or silicon. The common precondition of all these foundational concepts of cybernetics, switching, Boolean algebra, information theory, and feedback, is digitality. It is thus only when humans and machines operate on the same digital basis, when the knowledge of humans and that of machines can be made compatible, that the epistemology of cybernetics is itself able to be productive. The nature of analog and digital brought new conceptual dichotomies to the surface: entropy versus information, continuous versus discontinuous, linear versus nonlinear, singular versus repetition, probability versus improbability, the real versus the symbolic, nature versus artifact, and so on. Thus, the summary of the last conference of the Macy's Cybernetic Group draws a point of connection with its first conference in its opening lecture. Quote, we consider Turing's universal machine as a model for brains, employing Pitt's and McCullough's calculus for activity and nervous nets, end quote. After summing up the core meaning of the cybernetic meetings, Klaus Pius puts it in contrast with the world around us, writing, beyond being yet another affront to anthropology, all of this was a philosophical and historical challenge of the highest order, a challenge that, as the cybernetic episteme began to spread, prompted a great deal of concern throughout the next decade. Martin Heidegger, for instance, would proclaim the end of philosophy, and when pushed by Rudolf Augenstein's questioning, would name cybernetics as its successor. In light of the extent to which cybernetics had frustrated the relationship between the natural and the artificial, Goddard Gunther would claim that it represented the finale of Hegelian reflection metaphysics. For Arnold Galen, what would stand out about cybernetics is its objectification of the mind or spirit, Geist, which seemed to be synonymous with the perfection of technology and the last technical stage of human history. For his part, Max Bentz would be taken in by the conciliatory sphere of technical being, which is more comprehensive than the sphere of that which was once called nature or spirit, Geist, the human as technical existence. To me, this seems to be the most imposing task of tomorrow's philosophical anthropology. And Pierre Bertrand would predict, quote, the human beings who are integrated into these apparatuses must necessarily become different human beings. They will no longer fit the previous concept of human. The mutation of humanity is a necessity accompaniment to the rise of apparatuses. There will be a transition into a new and fourth form of material organization. After the mineral, plant, and animal kingdoms will come a kingdom in which the human though admittedly playing a significant role in this transition, will perhaps only be participating in a phenomena whose phenomena and consequences transcend him. In any case, Michael Foucault's famous image of man being, quote, erased like a face drawn on the sand at the edge of the sea has a cybernetic precedent, which put an end to the question of absolute knowledge and at the same time opened up another question: what is the human? The condition for embarking on such a return to the beginning of philosophy was, at any rate, the end of the human, and this would entail the following: no longer treating the human as the starting point for any pursuit of truth, and no longer speaking of his domination or liberation. Instead, the all-encompassing approach of cybernetics introduced a new epoch altogether.
The airborne computer is no longer a theory, nor an experiment. It's a fact, tested, functioning, practical, and restricted. It has gone into production under the label brain.
In conclusion, today AI is advancing at an alarming rate. It's already at a point where the billionaire tech overlords are talking about it in omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent terms. It's already involved in all our lives. It's digested practically all digitized data on record and can wield power over anything and everything. And yet, people are seemingly unaware of the point that we're at, or indifferent to its grasp on our lives.
Google acquired DeepMind several years ago. The thing that makes DeepMind unique is that DeepMind is absolutely focused on creating digital superintelligence, an AI that is vastly smarter than any human on Earth, and ultimately smarter than all humans on Earth combined. DeepMind's AI has administrator-level access to Google's servers to optimize energy usage at the data centers. However, this could be an unintentional Trojan horse. DeepMind has to have complete control of the data centers, so with a little software update, that AI could take complete control of the whole Google system, which means they can do anything. They can look at all your data, they can do anything.
And all this ties in very much with Brave New World, Aldous Huxley's book from 1933, of one possible dystopic future, one that apparently we've let creep up and try to come true. And in the opening chapter, Brave New World depicts a hatchery of babies who are born into a caste system of mental abilities, some fairly intelligent, others average, others quite dull, and others so simplistic and stupefied that they're merely humanistic, animal-like workers, but not very many Einsteins. From what we know, the system didn't seem to want a pool of geniuses aggressively competing with each other for ideas to challenge and improve things. This was a system that wanted stability, and it wanted its truly able members confined separately into a class of scientists who would hoard the knowledge and see it segregated from the rest of society. And the rest of people were not to have knowledge. They were to carry out basic functions in the bliss of ignorance, loving their servitude, as Aldous Huxley wrote about and talked about so much in his life. In conclusion, Alan Turing took a large bite out of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And what do we have to show for it? We're heading towards a future where the many have very little understanding of what's been developed and what its true import is, and where a centralized global system growing in power and using an even more powerful artificial intelligence machine is threatening to know and have knowledge of everything. Francis Bacon said that knowledge is power, and we're living in a time where we can see the importance of the balance of knowledge, who's holding it and who isn't, and what's becoming of us. Are we becoming wiser and more knowledgeable, or is the knowledge of our technology making us stupider and more compliant and easier to manage? Ask yourself what direction it's going.